Picture a city, not just any city, but the biggest in the world at its height, a shining symbol of power and splendor. Now, imagine that same city, Nineveh, the heart of the mighty Assyrian Empire, was built and kept alive by a system of such cold, calculated, and official brutality that its very name made people tremble across the ancient world. We're not talking about a few wartime excesses here and there. No, this was cruelty sanctioned by the state, carefully written down and paraded for all to see, all designed to crush the spirit of nations. This is the story of the Ninevites and the shocking depths of their cruelty, a reality more horrifying than you can imagine. Welcome. Today, we're stepping back in time, deep into ancient Mesopotamia, to the banks of the Tigris River, where the city of Nineveh once stood. For centuries, it was the bullseye of the Assyrian Empire, a civilization known for its incredible military, amazing buildings, and a library that was famous far and wide. But under all that progress was a dark, terrifying secret. Nineveh was the capital of cruelty. Terror wasn't just a messy side effect of war, it was a deliberate tool of the government. The Assyrians, and the Ninevites who called its greatest city home, cooked up a system of brutality so chillingly effective that history still shudders at it. They weren't just conquerors. They were experts in fear, using unbelievable pain and suffering to control a massive, often rebellious empire. And their kings? They didn't just allow these things. They bragged about them, carving their gruesome acts into stone for everyone to see, a permanent, chilling reminder of their reign of terror. So, brace yourselves. We're about to uncover the shocking truth about the Ninevites and the organized brutality that marked their time. What you're about to hear isn't for the faint of heart, but it's a vital, if grim, part of human history. The Assyrian Empire, with Nineveh eventually becoming its dazzling capital under King Sennacherib around 705 BCE, didn't get to the top through friendly chats and trade deals alone. Sure, it was a major cultural and religious hub, tied to the goddess Ishtar from early on, but its way of expanding was all about aggressive military force. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which lasted from 912 to 612 BCE, grew into the largest empire the world had ever seen, all thanks to its powerhouse military. It stretched all over Mesopotamia, the Levant, bits of Egypt, Anatolia, Persia, and Arabia. But how do you keep a grip on such a huge and varied territory, full of people with different languages, cultures, and loyalties? For the Assyrians, the answer was simple and horrifying: fear. Calculated terror became the main ingredient in their empire-building recipe. This wasn't just random violence. It was a carefully planned scare campaign to stop rebellions before they started and make sure everyone obeyed. The Assyrians knew that making a show of suffering could be a more powerful weapon than any army. They were pioneers in using cruelty on such a massive, systematic scale, making torture and mass killings deliberate military policy. Their armies were some of the best fighting forces of the ancient world, and they were among the first to be widely armed with iron weapons, which gave them a huge edge. They got really good at siege warfare, using all sorts of machines like battering rams and siege towers to break through city defenses. But honestly, even before they launched the final attack, the psychological game was often already won. The Assyrians' reputation preceded them, a reputation built on terrifying stories and detailed records of what happened to anyone who dared to fight back. This organized brutality wasn't just some unfortunate byproduct of their conquests. It was the very foundation their empire was built on. The message was crystal clear: give in, or face something worse than death. And the Ninevites, living in the empire's core, became the face of this terrifying strategy. The cruelty of the Ninevites and the wider Assyrian regime wasn't just impulsive savagery. It was a highly organized and disturbingly creative system. Their torture methods were varied and engineered to cause the most pain possible, both to the body and the mind, making sure victims became terrifying warnings to others. King Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BCE, is particularly notorious for his sadistic tendencies. His own records and palace carvings, found by archaeologists, show his exploits in graphic detail. He bragged about flaying rebellious nobles alive, skinning them, and then draping their skins over city walls or on pillars made just for this. A horrifying warning to anyone thinking of defying him. Just imagine the sheer terror. The skin of a captured leader, maybe someone known and respected, displayed publicly as a symbol of Assyrian vengeance. In one inscription, Ashurnasirpal II said, "I built a pillar over against his city gate, and I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up within the pillar, some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes, and I cut off the limbs of the officers who had rebelled." Impalement was another favorite. Victims were pierced with sharp stakes, sometimes driven up under the ribs, and then lifted up to die a slow, agonizing death, often left out for everyone to see. Carvings show rows of impaled captives, a chilling sight for any observer. Mutilation was everywhere and took many forms. Assyrian kings and soldiers regularly cut off hands, feet, noses, ears, and fingers of their captives. Blinding was common, with some accounts telling of kings personally gouging out enemies' eyes, sometimes with spears. Tongues were torn out, leaving victims to bleed to death, a punishment often saved for those who spoke against Assyrian gods or their authority. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 631 BCE, might be famous for his library, but he was just as cruel, ordering lips cut off and tongues torn out for what he saw as insults. Compared to other fates, beheading almost seemed like a kindness. But even then, the Assyrians found ways to maximize the terror, building pillars or pyramids of severed heads at the gates of conquered cities. Prisoners were sometimes forced to wear the severed heads of their friends or leaders around their necks as they were paraded. Another chilling method was the hook and bridle torture. Captives, especially leaders, were often led by ropes attached to hooks pierced through their noses or lips, a sign of total defeat and humiliation. Esarhaddon, another Assyrian king, wrote about parading conquered nobles through the streets, wearing the heads of their fellow nobles on their shoulders. He also recorded taking a defeated Arabian leader to Nineveh and making him live in a kennel with the dogs guarding the city gates, a truly dehumanizing act. These weren't random acts of rage by soldiers lost in the heat of battle. These were thought-out, officially approved methods of control, carefully recorded and publicized to make sure the message of Assyrian power and the cost of resistance was understood across their huge empire. The goal wasn't just to break bodies, but to shatter spirits, to make sure that the very idea of rebellion brought images of unimaginable suffering to mind. The Ninevites and their Assyrian overlords didn't just practice cruelty, they flaunted it. They knew the power of a public show and systematically used horrifying displays to terrorize their enemies and control conquered people. This was psychological warfare at its most raw. The aim was to plant such deep fear that it would kill any thought of resistance before it even started. Conquered cities often met horrific ends designed for maximum public shock. As we've talked about, the flayed skins of rebel leaders were put on prominent display on city walls. Imagine walking into a city, or even just getting near its gates, and seeing the leathery remains of its former defenders. A constant, silent scream of Assyrian revenge. Pyramids made from thousands of severed human heads were put up as gruesome monuments to Assyrian victory. King Shalmaneser III, Ashurnasirpal II's son, carried on his father's brutal traditions, ordering defeated soldiers beheaded and these awful head pyramids built at city gates. Publicly humiliating captives was a major tactic. Prisoners, sometimes stripped naked, were marched through the streets of Nineveh or other Assyrian cities, where locals might throw stones and trash at them. Defeated kings and nobles got especially degrading treatment. Besides being forced into dog kennels, like that Arabian leader under Esarhaddon, they might be yoked like animals and made to pull chariots or take part in humiliating parades, often while wearing the severed heads of their relatives around their necks. These displays were meant to strip away every last bit of dignity and show off the Assyrian king's absolute power. The Assyrians also carried out mass deportations, uprooting entire populations and scattering them across the empire. While this had practical benefits like breaking local loyalties and getting labor, the act of being forcibly removed was itself terrifying, tearing families and communities apart and throwing them into an uncertain future in strange lands. This was psychological warfare targeting a people's very identity. Even the land wasn't safe. The Assyrians systematically destroyed the farms and resources of conquered areas, cutting down orchards, poisoning wells, and burning crops. This didn't just cause immediate hardship and famine. It was a long-term punishment designed to break a region's ability to support itself or any future rebellion. It was a scorched earth policy meant to leave a lasting scar of ruin. King Sennacherib, who turned Nineveh into his magnificent capital, bragged on the Taylor Prism that so much blood flowed from executions and disembowelments that his horses waded through it like a river. Whether these claims were exaggerated or horrifyingly true, they were meant to be heard far and wide, adding to the air of invincibility and terror that surrounded the Assyrian war machine. These weren't just wartime excesses. They were carefully calculated moves of statecraft. The Assyrians wrote down these atrocities in their royal records and showed them in graphic detail on the carvings that decorated their palace walls. These weren't hidden away. They were meant to be seen by visiting VIPs and their own people, reinforcing the king's power and the price of disloyalty. The message was plain and simple. The Assyrian state was built on terror, and Nineveh was its horrifying display case. The boundless cruelty of the Ninevites and the Assyrian Empire wasn't the work of rogue commanders or out-of-control soldiers. It was a deeply ingrained official part of their state, woven into their military, their government, and even their way of thinking. This systematic approach to brutality is what made them so uniquely terrifying in the ancient world. Assyrian kings, as we've seen, openly boasted about their cruel acts in official inscriptions and decorated their palaces with lavish carvings, graphically showing torture and executions. These weren't apologies for regrettable necessities. They were proud declarations of power and ruthlessness, meant to cement their authority and scare off rivals. The Taylor Prism of Sennacherib, for example, meticulously details his campaigns and the brutal crushing of enemies, painting these acts as heroic achievements. This official stamp of approval turned cruelty from a mere tactic into a celebrated part of being king. The military was the main tool for this policy. Soldiers were trained and expected to carry out these horrifying acts. The Assyrian army was a highly organized and disciplined force, and its effectiveness was partly due to the psychological punch of its known brutality. The promise of loot was definitely a motivator, but the order to inflict "don't mess with us" suffering came from the very top. The sheer scale and consistency of these atrocities, across different campaigns and under various kings, all point to a centralized doctrine of terror. What's more, there's evidence that this cruelty was sometimes tied to their religious beliefs and pagan practices. The Assyrians worshipped a whole lineup of gods, with Ashur as their main deity. Some scholars suggest that the extreme violence was, at times, presented as being done for these gods, or as punishment for those who defied Assyrian divine orders. The prophet Nahum, in his biblical smackdown of Nineveh, calls it a city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder. The lies could mean deceptive treaties, as historical records hint that Nineveh often made deals they never planned to keep, another piece of their ruthless way of running things. The empire's administration also had a hand in it. Conquered lands were often ruled by local governors who answered to the Assyrian king and were expected to enforce Assyrian policies, including squashing any dissent with harsh measures. The system of mass deportations needed serious logistical planning, which further shows how deeply these practices were built into the state machine. Even the art and architecture of Nineveh and other Assyrian cities helped to reinforce this climate of intimidation. The giant statues of winged bulls with human heads, Lamassu, that guarded palace entrances weren't just for show. They were imposing symbols of power designed to awe and intimidate anyone who visited. The endless carvings of battles, sieges, and the gruesome fates of enemies were a constant reminder of Assyrian dominance. This institutionalization meant that cruelty wasn't the exception, it was the rule. It was a predictable and expected response to any challenge to Assyrian authority. It created a world where people in the empire lived under a constant threat of horrific violence, a system built to ensure obedience through overwhelming fear. The Ninevites, living in the capital, would have known all about these practices, living right next to the monuments that celebrated them. Their society, in many ways, was built on and sustained by this terrifying system of official brutality. The chilling effectiveness of Ninevite cruelty echoed across the ancient Near East, leaving behind a wasteland of broken kingdoms and traumatized people. While the Assyrians were the ones dishing out this suffering, it's so important to remember the victims whose lives were forever scarred or brutally ended. Conquered leaders and the elite often got the most elaborate and humiliating forms of torture. Royal captives weren't just killed, they were made into public examples. As we've discussed, they might be blinded while held with hooks through their lips, forced to wear the severed heads of their relatives, or locked up in animal kennels. These acts were meant to totally destroy their status and serve as a grim warning to other rulers. The Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, for instance, specifically wrote down how he dealt with rebellious city leaders, flaying them and displaying their skins. The psychological damage on those who saw or heard about such fates must have been crushing. Ordinary people were definitely not spared. Entire cities that resisted Assyrian attacks faced mass slaughter, enslavement, and deportation. The prophets of the Old Testament paint horrifying pictures of Assyrian atrocities. Nahum calls Nineveh a bloody city, Nahum 3:1, a city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. This wasn't just dramatic talk. It reflected what people actually went through under Assyrian rule. There are accounts of children being dashed in pieces at street corners, a brutal practice that mirrored what the Assyrians themselves had done to cities like Thebes. Women and young girls were burned alive or taken as slaves or into harems. The biblical kingdoms of Israel and Judah were among those who suffered terribly under Assyrian attacks. The Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE led to the mass deportation of its people, the so-called 10 lost tribes. King Sennacherib's campaigns in Judah are well documented, both in Assyrian records like the Taylor Prism and in the Bible. Carvings from Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh graphically show the siege of Lachish, with Judean prisoners being impaled, flayed, and beheaded. These images, carved in stone, are horrifying visual proof of the suffering they inflicted. Sennacherib boasted of capturing 46 walled cities of Judah and trapping King Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a caged bird. The sheer scale of the violence was just overwhelming. Sennacherib's claim about his horses wading through rivers of blood from the dead hints at the immense human cost of Assyrian warfare. Ashurnasirpal II's inscriptions detail burning captives, cutting off their hands and feet, and putting out their eyes. He describes making pillars of living people and of heads. One chilling account from Ashurnasirpal II states, "Many captives from among them I burned with fire, and many I took as living captives. From some I cut off their hands and their fingers, and from others I cut off their noses, their ears. Of many I put out the eyes." The historical record, backed up by archaeological finds like palace carvings and cuneiform tablets, confirms these stories of widespread brutality. The Ninevites, as the main inhabitants of the empire's heartland, weren't just sitting on the sidelines. They were participants and beneficiaries of this system of terror. Their grand city, its palaces, and its temples were, in a very real way, built on the suffering and exploitation of countless victims. Nahum's lament, 3:19, "Who has not felt your endless cruelty?" serves as a powerful epitaph for the countless unnamed people who died or endured unspeakable horrors at the hands of the Assyrian war machine, with Nineveh at its center. An empire built on such a foundation of limitless cruelty and universal hatred just couldn't last forever. The very terror that the Ninevites and the Assyrian regime used to control their huge territories eventually planted the seeds of their own downfall. The brutality that made Nineveh feared also made it hated by everyone. Nearby nations, and even the people they'd conquered within the empire, were simmering with resentment, just waiting for a chance to hit back at their oppressors. Internally, the Neo-Assyrian Empire started to show cracks after its last great king, Ashurbanipal, died around 627 BCE. A series of nasty civil wars broke out as different people fought for the throne, weakening the government and tying up the military. This internal mess gave Assyria's enemies the opening they'd been hoping for. A coalition of these angry nations, mainly led by the Babylonians under Nabopolassar and the Medes under Cyaxares, rose up against their former masters. For years, these groups had suffered under Assyrian rule, paying huge tributes and living under the constant threat of brutal punishment. Now, they saw their chance for payback. The Allied forces launched a major campaign against the Assyrian heartland. After trashing other important Assyrian cities, they finally reached the mighty capital itself, Nineveh. In 612 BCE, this grand city, once thought to be the largest and strongest in the world, was surrounded. Accounts suggest the siege was tough, lasting for 3 months, from late spring into the summer. The Fall of Nineveh Chronicle, a Babylonian historical record, gives us the details. It talks about a heavy siege followed by a major defeat for the Assyrians. There are also historical and even biblical hints, like the prophecy in the Book of Nahum, that a flood played a part in the city's fall. It's thought that the Tigris River, or one of its smaller rivers, might have flooded, damaging or weakening a section of Nineveh's massive walls, which stretched for over 12 kilometers. This breach, whether from the flood or the relentless attack of the besiegers, let the enemy forces pour into the city. What happened next was a scene of horrific slaughter, likely echoing the very brutality the Assyrians had inflicted on others for centuries. Bitter house-to-house fighting broke out as the remaining Assyrian defenders fought desperately. The city was plundered, its magnificent palaces and temples looted and burned. Archaeological digs have found layers of ash and debris, confirming a violent end. Many unburied skeletons found by archaeologists testify to the massacre of its people. Those who couldn't escape were either killed or deported, their great city turned into mounds and heaps, as the Babylonian Chronicle dramatically put it. Though that was a bit of an exaggeration, as the city did see some lesser occupation later on. The prophet Nahum had predicted Nineveh's destruction, calling it a divine judgment for its bloodshed and cruelty. Nahum 3:1 declared, "Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey." Its downfall was met with relief, even joy, by those who had suffered under its oppressive rule. The empire that had terrorized the ancient world for centuries collapsed, and Nineveh, its proud and cruel capital, was reduced to ruins, its power gone. The Assyrian Empire effectively ended by 605 BCE, its lands divided between the victorious Babylonians and Medes. The story of Nineveh is a stark warning about how unchecked power and officially sanctioned cruelty can bring an empire crashing down. It's a dark piece of history for sure, but it's packed with lessons that still hit home today. If this dive into the terrifying heart of ancient Nineveh grabbed you, or if you're keen to learn more about history's forgotten corners and shocking truths, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We explore stories just like this every week, and we really want to hear from you. What part of Ninevite cruelty did you find the most shocking? Or are there other brutal ancient civilizations you'd like us to shine a light on? Drop a comment below. Your thoughts and ideas help our community grow and explore even more fascinating and sometimes frightening historical tales. Nineveh's legacy is a complicated one. It was a city of huge cultural significance, home to vast libraries like Ashurbanipal's, which saved priceless knowledge of Mesopotamian civilizations for thousands of years. Its buildings were legendary in their day. Yet all this cultural brilliance is forever stained by the systematic, state-sponsored brutality that came to define the Assyrian Empire and its capital. The Ninevites perfected terror as a way to govern, bragging about flaying, impalement, mass beheadings, and tortures so awful they're hard to imagine, all designed to break their enemies' spirits. Their cruelty wasn't just a byproduct of war, it was a calculated official policy, carefully written down and proudly shown off. They built an empire on fear, an empire that eventually fell to the very hatred it had stirred up. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes wasn't just the end of a city, it was the end of an age where cruelty was openly used as the ultimate weapon of power. The ruins of Nineveh, found again in the 19th century near modern-day Mosul, Iraq, are still giving up their secrets, confirming the historical and biblical accounts of its grandeur and its violent end. The story of the Ninevites stands as a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for calculated brutality, but also as a lesson that empires built on such foundations are doomed to fall. Their limitless cruelty carved their name into history, not as heroes, but as a synonym for terror. Thanks for joining us on this dark journey. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that history, in all its shades, has so much to teach us.